So I'm not done, guys. So the esteemed attorney Dennis Sperling, he has a podcast here on YouTube, and he also broadcasts on Instagram and Facebook and maybe TikTok. He has argued recently and quite convincingly that African nations owe foundational Black Americans reparations. This is a part that's never talked about in the reparations because it's usually about the American government. African nations do too. Even though some people think the modern day nations don't deserve to be included with what happened in these kingdoms, they inherited the wealth and the debt of those prior kingdoms. As in such, they inherited the debt of modern day slavery, which many of them still practice illegally, but it was legal in Mauritania until 2003. So there's a convincing case that they should be doing reparations.
Hey y'all, I'm Michelle Mazelleغ. Welcome back to my channel. The video clip that I just shared with you all is this new thing that some African Americans are coming up with now. The issue of reparations is always a topic during Juneteenth. Juneteenth was yesterday. This video actually was put out a couple of months ago. So it's not a new video, but it definitely is, you know, this new thing that some African Americans are now claiming that the African nations owe foundational Black Americans reparations. This is the type of narrative that you would hear from the British government. There's a video that a lady on CNN actually went on CNN and said this about reparations as far as the UK's responsibility in it.
Well, I think you're right about reparations in terms of if people want it, though, what they need to do is you always need to go back to the beginning of a supply chain. Where was the beginning of the supply chain? That was in Africa.
Now, when it's coming from someone from the UK, totally, I'm not surprised, because the UK is always trying to take their hands out of the responsibility of the transatlantic slave trade so they don't have to pay any money. So what she's saying is not really surprising. But when you hear this type of rhetoric and this type of propaganda, this type of myth coming from African Americans, I just have to be like, really? Like, you have that much of a strong dislike for the African continent and for the people on the African continent that you really want to sit there and say that the African nations owe foundational Black Americans or African Americans reparations? Really? I think they tend to forget, this man and whoever else is making this crazy claim, is that there's also collaborators and corroborators. When we're talking about the Jim Crow era, we're talking about slavery, there were African Americans who were working against other African Americans, who were helping their oppressors, who were helping the slave owners, who were helping the people that were doing wrong. They were helping those people to capture other African Americans. They were helping them to know what the African Americans were doing. They were actually working against their people. There were African Americans that were working against African Americans and working with the oppressors and working with slave masters. Are those individuals, are the families of those individuals, are they not going to be compensated for the wrong decisions of those individuals? Are they not going to be compensated? Is reparations not going to be given to those families if it comes to find out that this individual, within that family made a crazy decision, made a wrong decision, and actually went against his own people? That's a conversation that needs to be had. If we're going to start pointing fingers at the chiefs of Africa, at these African nations, then we're going to have to look deeper into corroborators and collaborators that happened during the slavery time and during Jim Crow era. Now, Django, even though the character in Django is definitely an exaggerated character, there were some African Americans like that during that time. They were working against their own people, because they were working against their people either to protect their family, protect themselves, or feeling like if they work with their oppressors, if they work with the slave masters, then they were going to get something good in return. And of course, we all know that's never been the case. But that still didn't keep them from working against African Americans. So are those the families of those individuals, are they not going to be compensated? Are they not going to receive reparations because of the decisions of an individual within that family? Of course they're still going to be they're going to get reparations for that. Of course they're going to get compensated for that. You don't really know what was going on with that person for the reason why they worked against their own people, but it happens. Now when we're talking about the chiefs of the African nations, when people continue to say that these chiefs sold their own people, first of all, that's a narrative that I've said time and time again that needs to be stopped. Okay, the Germans gave compensation to the Jews, even though we all know that there were some Jews that also helped Germans. They also helped Germans to either protect themselves or protect their families, but the Germans still gave reparations to the Jews. No one is sitting there saying the Europeans sold Europeans. It's a clear distinction between those two groups of people. People are able to tell the difference between the two. But then when you get to the continent of Africa, all of a sudden they're not able to differentiate between the Dahomey tribe and the Ashanti. They're not able to differentiate between those two groups of people, but they're somehow able to differentiate between the Germans and the Jews, even though they all look the same. They're able to differentiate between the Greeks and the Romans, even though they all look the same. So that narrative needs to stop spreading around, because it's a false narrative. It's a propaganda narrative as well, and it doesn't really do anything for African Americans as far as the case of gaining any type of reparations. The whole purpose of reparations is to look to the people who gained the most, and the empires of Africa, the nations of Africa, did not substantially gain anything from the transatlantic slave trade. Did they gain some resources to help them fight against the Europeans that they actually did not succeed into? Yes, it did. It allowed them to get some type of guns to protect their people during that time. But as far as those countries for the long haul gaining anything for the transatlantic slave trade, you can look at the countries now and see that they did not gain a lot. If they gained a lot, the countries will be a lot more developed. If you look at the history as far as the transatlantic slave trade and what it left behind, what the Europeans left those African empires with, you will see they left them with nothing. They took over their empires. They destroyed their empires. They killed the people within it. They took their culture. They made a mockery of their culture and their religion. And ultimately that led into the Berlin Conference, which was the scramble for Africa, where they split up these areas that didn't need to be split up, putting ethnic groups together that didn't need to be put together. I mean, come on. The transatlantic slave trade did not benefit these nations of Africa whatsoever. You know that, they know that, the world knows that, and the only reason why you're going on with that narrative is because for whatever reason you dislike the African continent and want them to be responsible for whatever way for the demise of the African Americans, and that's just crazy talk. That's just crazy talk. And that's not the type of talk that needs to be talking when we're talking about reparations. Reparations is for the governments and institutions that their wealth increased and got bigger, and they were able to develop on the backs of enslaved Africans and during the transatlantic slave trade, during slavery for African Americans, and the Jim Crow era. That is what you're seeking reparations for. For the governments and institutions that gained a lot of wealth. That was not the African nations. That was not the chiefs of Africa. None of them gained an extensive amount of wealth from the transatlantic slave trade. Come on now. Africa does not need to be a part of the conversation unless it's them talking about that they want to get reparations, like the president of Ghana said. They want to get reparations for the destruction that the Europeans left these empires with when they left, yeah, they can seek reparations. I think African Americans need to remember that they're not the only person that's a part of the reparations conversation. Any person of African descent who wants to seek reparations from the people that is to blame for the reason why they're dispersed all over the place, for the reason why that their countries or their people are not as far as they should be, they have a right to seek reparations. It's not only African Americans that suffered from the transatlantic slave trade. And the reason why we feel like we're the only ones that suffered is because we're in a country where we're the minority. But there's other people in these other countries on these other continents that's also having the negative effect of transatlantic slave trade. They're also having the effect of slavery. And so they also have to be a part of that reparations conversation. It can't just be African Americans. We are only seeking reparations from the U.S. government. The African continent doesn't need to be a part of that conversation whatsoever, because they didn't gain anything from the transatlantic slave trade. So that argument, that narrative needs to be put to rest. It doesn't need to be said anymore, because then you're going to have to start talking about then the African Americans who were also collaborators and corroborators during the slavery time, during Jim Crow era time, because we know that they were also in existence. But they're not to blame for anything that happened to those people that they worked against. You know why? Because they were victims. That's why. You're able to know they're victims. But for some people, nobody wants to think that the chiefs of the African empires during the transatlantic slave trade were victims. They'll see those individual African Americans as victims, but won't have the same type of perspective and same type of compassion to these chiefs of Africa who were also victims. That's all I have to say on that very quick little video, because when I seen that video pop up on my feed, I was just like, what? Really? Come on. I don't want to see that during this time of the year. All right. I am Michele Mazelleغ. Thank you all for watching. Make sure you like and subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next video. Bye.